Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. Let's enter Fantasyland for a moment. Let's pretend for a sec that our country had a news media that was interested in bringing you the news, not in lecturing you about your moral inferiority, you're so bad, or lying to you in transparently obvious ways. January 6th was an insurrection, guys. Or even in forcing you to repeat whatever childish slogan they've come up with this week. Vladimir Putin is a war criminal. Okay. Trans women are women. All right. Say it or else. Let's imagine instead that we live somewhere completely different, in a country where the media felt obligated to tell you what was actually happening in the world and why it matters. What stories would we be talking about right now if we lived in that country? Well, here are the first two. Earlier this month, Iran and Saudi Arabia, the two most significant powers in the Muslim world, announced that after generations of proxy wars and snarling hostility to one another, they will be resuming diplomatic relations. Peace has broken out between blood enemies. As recently as last year, very few would have thought that could happen, and now it has happened. And it's happened, and here's a significant thing from an American perspective, it's happened because China, not the U.S. State Department, but the Communist Chinese government, brokered the deal. Religious conflict between two theocracies. Did you see that coming? Probably not, but there's more. Yesterday, China's President Xi turned up in Moscow to announce a new partnership with Russia. Going forward, Russia will supply much of China's oil and natural gas. Vladimir Putin also agreed to use Chinese currency in trade with Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Once again, holy smokes. As with the Iran-Saudi summit, very few people imagined anything like this could happen just 18 months ago. Quote, change that hasn't happened in 100 years, Xi said, is coming, and we are driving this change together. Now, what change was Xi talking about? Well, the end of American global hegemony, the end of the U.S. dollar as the world's reserve currency. For 100 years, he got it right, since the close of the First World War, the United States has been the preeminent nation on Earth. For 40 of those years, we were locked in a Cold War with the Soviet Union, of course, but at no time, no matter what they may have claimed, was there ever really a question about who was the most powerful country. We were the most powerful country. It was the American era. That era just ended, a little over 2 years into Joe Biden's presidency. But amazingly, no one in this country seems to notice that it happened. That story is not leading the news tonight. Instead, we're arguing about whether or not to arrest Donald Trump for a fake crime to keep him from running for president again. Over at the White House, our senile president just gave some sort of medal to a sitcom actress, presumably for her bravery. You read those scripts so boldly. CNN is covering that story like it's the moonwalk. On Twitter, meanwhile, people seem excited that our vice president has sent a letter to a transvestite TikTok star called Dylan Mulvaney, who is famous for dressing like a 6-year-old girl. Kamala Harris is very proud of him. That's the news we're getting. It is Weimar, but dumber. Meanwhile, the world beyond Morning Joe is changing faster than at any time in, well, as Chairman Xi correctly noted, about 100 years. None of these changes will make life better for your grandchildren. But since many Americans don't even know they're happening, the outcry here has been limited to a few insightful but deeply frustrated bloggers on social media. They see clearly what's happening. No one else seems to. It's driving them insane. There are still people in this country, for example, who seem to believe that the so-called climate agenda is actually about the climate or about the environment of the Earth or something, and not a coordinated effort by the government of China to hobble the U.S. and the West and take its place as the leader of the world, which of course is exactly what's going on. It's pretty obvious when you think about it, but most people don't get a chance to think about it because the propaganda is just too thick. It's unceasing. It never ends. Here's the latest on the front page of papers around the country. The head of the United Nations demanding the United States blow up its own economy, otherwise the world will end.
Humans are responsible for virtually all global heating over the last 200 years. The rate of temperature rise in the last half-century is the highest in 2,000 years. Concentrations of carbon dioxide are at their highest in at least 2 million years. The climate time bomb is ticking.
So when someone who knows nothing about science, whose job it is to act as a proxy, a puppet of the Chinese government, starts wagging his finger in your face, claiming scientific expertise and telling you what to do with your economy, at the very least, you should pause for a moment. And you should also remember that the United Nations has been saying pretty much the same thing since at least 1989. That's the year that the Associated Press reported that, and we're quoting, a senior UN environmental official says entire nations could be wiped off the face of the earth by rising sea levels if the global warming trend is not reversed by the year 2000. That was 34 years ago. Happy to report we're still here. So has the science changed? Well, apparently it has. Not that anyone will acknowledge that. But the shouting remains exactly the same. And the AP doesn't seem to have archives it can check to find out, have we written the story before? So they just keep writing the same story. 2 days ago, they wrote this, and we're quoting. Humanity still has a chance, close to the last, to prevent the worst of climate change's future harms, a top United Nations panel of scientists said Monday. But doing so requires quickly slashing nearly 2/3 of carbon pollution by 2035. Okay, Associated Press. There's even a quote from the UN Secretary General. Again, not a scientist, a puppet of China, but pretty good at slogans. And we're quoting, humanity is on thin ice, and that ice is melting fast. Are they publishing the same piece and just moving the dates around? Not really, actually. Because if you read it closely, if you took a look at the UN's entire report, and actually we spent the day doing that, there are big differences in how they plan to solve global warming. This time, the plan is much more explicit. Make the West, the United States primarily, but also Western Europe, blow up its own economy, while China, the fastest growing economy in the world, doesn't have to do anything. And in fact, they're not doing anything. China is currently building, well, 2 new coal plants every week. Every week. Not good at math, but that's like 104 a year? That's a lot of coal plants. How many are we building a week? 0. Pretty weird for a country committed to fighting climate change. Well, the report says that compared to Eastern Asia, North American countries have a 33% greater obligation. How do you measure obligation? Is there a scientific scale for that? But a greater obligation, 33% more, to accelerate spending on, quote, mitigation investment flows to, quote, limit global warming. Okay, the West has that obligation. Now, if you were to go by, like, real numbers, you might notice that China's carbon emissions today are more than double our carbon emissions here in the United States. So we're spewing less carbon, they're spewing a lot more carbon, but we have to spend more because we have a moral obligation. Because why? That's not explained. But later in the report, the United Nations does say this, quote, actions that prioritize equity, climate justice, social justice, and inclusion lead to more sustainable outcomes, co-benefits, reduce trade-offs, support transformative change, and advance climate-resilient development. Adaptation responses are immediately needed to reduce rising climate risks, especially for the most vulnerable. Equity, inclusion, and just transitions are key to progress on adaptation and deep societal ambitions for accelerated migration. That's science. Try not to use a swear word on TV, but I think we know what that is. It's BS. The report continues, we need, quote, meaningful participation and inclusive planning informed by cultural values and indigenous knowledge. Indigenous knowledge. Now, how much of that, that's directly from the UN report, how much of that sounded to you, probably not a credentialed scientist, but a person with common sense, how much of that sounded like science? All of it, says CNN, all of it!
Humanity is on thin ice, and that ice melting fast. That warning, courtesy of the United Nations Secretary General, made in tandem with a brand new United Nations report labeling the planet a ticking time bomb.
It is worse than we ever thought it was going to be, and the time is ticking in order to defuse this climate bomb.
The climate time bomb is ticking. That's according to the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's report.
There's no such thing as climate alarmism anymore. The time bomb is ticking.
The new UN report warns the climate time bomb is ticking and the world is running out of time to avoid catastrophe.
There's no such thing as climate alarmism anymore. Nothing you say can be too extreme. It doesn't matter. That's science. For the Chinese, it's just so easy. How do you win a war without fighting? By getting your adversary to kill himself. Well, how do you convince a strong, self-respecting, powerful country like ours that has ruled the world for 100 years to do that? Turns out it's pretty easy. You take a collection of dumb, desperate people in middle age, hoping to keep on to their stupid TV jobs. You add scripts and some hairspray, and they just repeat the lies for you, And then all the people in the country sort of nod, yeah, that's exactly right. We got to do that. Respect indigenous knowledge. Stop driving our cars. And the amazing thing, it's kind of working. So what exactly is the science behind all this? Well, on Substack, where actual scientists now reside, a political scientist called Roger Pilkey did a deep dive on where these people got the idea that the world will end if temperatures jump 1.5 degrees Celsius. That's the globally accepted goal, according to the AP. Well, it turns out that globally accepted goal originated in a newspaper advertisement and a draft paper that was not even peer-reviewed. Now, it's in the Paris Climate Agreement. That's the power of marketing. But what's the point, of course? What's the point of the marketing? It's to destroy one civilization to be supplanted by the next civilization. Unfortunately, we're the one being destroyed, or that is destroying itself. And no one at the UN, by the way, cares about the data, where it came from, because the real goal has nothing to do with the environment. Of course. Duh! Look at the pollution! If you cared about the environment, this is a tough time to live. But ever since Julian Huxley took over UNESCO in the 1940s, pushing Malthusianism, the idea that the world's overpopulated has been the dominant way of thinking for the people in charge, except with respect to their own families, they have as many kids as they want, but you're not allowed to. And that leads to moments like the one we saw a month ago, where the Harvard historian, Naomi Oreskes, wrote an op-ed in Scientific American entitled 8 billion people in the world is a crisis, not an achievement. Well, if you're one of those 8 billion, that seems like hostility. If some chick is writing a piece in a science magazine about how your existence is bad, that might make you nervous, right? It should. And it may explain why these people oppose nuclear energy, which seems like a solution, but they're against that too. So it's not really about carbon emissions, is it? It's about hurting people, specific people. They think there are too many people. And this view is very widespread. It's why the leaders of the Democratic Party are always in your face telling you to get an abortion. Hurry up and get an abortion. It'll help the GDP. It doesn't hurt, of course, that getting rid of fossil fuels would mean a lot of Democratic Party leaders will get a lot richer. Their donors certainly will, the ones in the renewable industry. It also means a ton of money for people with no skills at all, like Jen Granholm, who's now the energy secretary, who owns stock in these green energy companies while she was in office. It's also corrupt. It's unbelievable. And they're in your face. There's no such thing as climate alarmism. Shut up and accept it. This would explain why Joe Biden campaigned on ending fossil fuels and bringing about economic devastation for millions of Americans back in 2020.
Would there be any place for fossil fuels, including coal and fracking, in a Biden administration?
No, we would work it out. We would make sure it's eliminated and no more subsidies for either one of those, any fossil fuel.
No more subsidies for fossil fuel industry. No more drilling on federal lands. No more drilling, including offshore. No ability for the oil industry to continue to drill, period.
But I want you to look in my eyes. I guarantee you, we're going to end fossil fuel, and I am not going to cooperate with it, okay?
Imagine living under the rule of people like that. Imagine living in a system where we, with a straight face, ask someone who's never had a real job in his entire life, who has no idea where electricity comes from, probably can't even change a light bulb at this point, about our energy policy, and then taking his answer seriously. And what do you get when you do that? And apparently we did. 81 million votes he got, more than Obama. Really? Shut up and accept it. Well, the result is now our strategic petroleum reserve, maybe the most valuable thing the United States government owns, is depleted, and Russia, which we say we hate, is now once again one of the most important energy suppliers in the world. Meanwhile, your energy prices went up at double the rate of inflation last year. So what are we looking at here? Well, there are people with economic agendas benefiting from solar panels and the wind farms that kill endangered species. And there are the illiterate cultists in academia who are just for this because they're for it. As if to prove that point, Greta Thunberg, who just deleted a tweet from 5 years ago saying the world's going to end in 5 years, is about to get an honorary degree from the University of Helsinki. This is a girl who made a living by not attending school. So what's the degree in? It's not science, not climatology. It's theology. But the real agenda, of course, is much bigger than any of that. It's the great global reshuffling that is going on now beneath the notice of most Americans. We're going to wake up one day and realize we're not in charge. And this is part of the reason. Eva Vlaardingerbroek is a Dutch legal philosopher who lives in the middle of a society in Europe that's being transformed by the climate agenda. Eva, appreciate your coming on tonight. Is it clear to people in Europe that this is just a straight-out power play by the Chinese government to displace the West?
No, not clear enough, I'm afraid. I don't think that they see through the real agenda behind this. And obviously, you know, these people know only how to rule by fear. So what is happening is not just China, but also our government officials, you know, our elites obviously benefit from a fearful society, from fearful people. People are afraid that the world is going to end, because what is a better way to get people to comply to the things that you say that they have to do than by, you know, having them actually fear for their lives? You know, that's always the globalist tragedy. We've seen it with COVID, but the climate is probably even more effective because, well, if you really believe that the world's going to end, you know, what is there that you wouldn't do in order to save the planet? And so that strategy of creating a crisis, you know, of saying, well, we have an emergency and it needs to be solved now. We are on thin ice. We're all going to die. You know, that's incredibly effective. And the solution that they always present you with is that we, us ordinary people, have to give up our rights, our property, and our freedom in order to solve this so-called crisis. You know, it's always a rules for thee, but not for me type of situation. That is why we are the only ones that will end up not eating meat, not flying anymore, not being allowed to drive our cars. But for them, nothing ever changes.
I just got to wonder how the people who are pushing this, and I think some of them are doing it in good faith, I think they're really afraid the end of the world is coming and they blame themselves. But how do they explain China building 2 new coal plants a week? Why is that cool in a world in which carbon dioxide is considered poison?
Right. Well, you can't explain it, right? So that shows you that there is a different agenda behind this. You know, you can't argue with these people rationally, really. And the fact that you can't, you know, the fact that, for example, in the Netherlands, you know, you've all seen what happens to, or what is happening to our Dutch farmers. We are such a tiny little country, yet our government says that we are the biggest nitrogen polluter in the world, and that all of our farms need to be gone by 2030 to solve this so-called crisis, you know. And Germany, for example, is not even subjected to those rules. So all of this is completely arbitrary. So we need to think past the lies that they are trying to sell us. You know, we need to wake up to the real agenda behind this. And that is, well, I'm sad to say it, but very simple one. It's always about money and it's always about power.
When they tell you to get rid of your farms, I think that's a red flag. I don't think I'm paranoid. I think that's fair. Eva Vlaardingerbroek, great to see you tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Tucker.
So a lot of us spent all day waiting for the indictment in the Donald Trump case from the Manhattan District Attorney. It didn't happen. What can we expect tomorrow? Is it coming? What is the latest on that? We're going to get the latest. Plus, you'll never guess who just got a huge bailout from the Biden administration. All these bailouts are not being reported on TV. Why is that? We'll tell you what it was straight ahead.